South Africa is one of the all-time greatest mining jurisdictions. Today, the South African mining industry is at a crossroads. We talked to Mike Solomon to understand its prospects. Michael, welcome and thank you for joining us here.
Thank you so much for having me, Asa.
You've worn many hats over the years, an engineer, businessman, academic, political activist, but South Africa and mining have been the constant. How did you get into mining?
So I was actually born and bred into the industry. I come from an old Kimberley family where mining literally originated in South Africa in 1867. My great-grandfather was a diamond digger in Kimberley, and my father was a mining engineer. I was born and bred in this gold mining town called Stilfontein, so it's in my DNA.
And South Africa, it is one of the all-time greatest mining jurisdictions. It has supplied the world with minerals and metals for centuries. But what would you say is the status of the South African mining sector today?
We've undergone a major contraction since the change in government, the transformation to democracy. So, for example, in 1990, on Mandela's release, the South African minerals industry contributed 43% of the value on global stock exchanges. Today, we, for various reasons, account for only slightly less than 4%. And so, whereas we were once the greatest mining nation in the world, we have now more or less become statistically insignificant as a mining nation.
And this decline in the South African mining industry, is it geological or technical constraints, or is it only political?
It's not only political. The thing is that mining by nature is the exploitation and winning of non-renewable resources. A mine may last 10 years. Typically, your large mines have a life of mine of 30 to 50 years, but ultimately they run out. And so one has to continually reinvest as the mine's resources and reserves decline through exploitation. One has always got new projects coming on stream where exploration has been done. It takes probably a large mine 10 to 15 years to build the mine and to bring it on stream and to build it up to full steady state production. And so what has happened is that we've had a natural decline in the resource base, particularly in our gold mining industry. But there's been no new investments, and so while we've continued to deplete our resources, we've not been building up the necessary replacement resources. And so that is probably one of the major factors. And so it's a bit of both. It's a natural depletion of resources through mining, but because of the uncertainty in our policy regime, we have very little investment for the last 10 years. And so the new investment in new mines has fallen back. There are other systemic factors. The global commodities trade is a cyclical trade, and so we've also had global economic reasons for the decline in our sector as well. But that said, we've been through a couple of spikes within the mining industry globally, and South Africa has missed out on 2 or 3 of the boom cycles over the last 10 to 15 years.
What would you like to see in terms of policy to revert the situation?
Well, Policy 101, I mean, any policy workshop that you ever go to or a book that you read, the first page will tell you that policy certainty is an absolute prerequisite for investment, because a mine, for example, with the mine that I developed is $1 billion worth of mine, or short of $1 billion worth of, a large platinum or gold mine is going to cost that sort of capital. And it's a long-term business. It's 10 to 15 years to build, as I said to you earlier on. And then you've got to recover your capital and make a profit for your shareholders over a period of 30 to 50 years. And so where you have policy uncertainty is that investors have got competition. South Africa is a fantastic minerals regime and domain, but we do have competition. We've got competition from Latin America, we've got competition from from the North America, Canadians mining industry, Canada's mining industry is alive and well. The US is still developing deposits, Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia. And so, like any other market, when you're competing for capital, your investors will go where they, A, are going to get the best return on their capital, and B, where they have certainty that they're going to get their money back. So where we have this policy uncertainty because of the political restitution that is necessary around the mining industry, it's deterred investors. And unfortunately, as we go through a phase of resource nationalism that is compounded by corrupt government, it's had a massive impact on our investability as a nation.
So you mentioned that South Africa's mining industry is shrinking. Can it not be seen as a positive, meaning that South Africa is moving away from a primary to industrial economy? And isn't that what resource nations should aspire to do?
Yes and no. If one looks, and I mentioned the fact that I come from a Kimberley family, in fact, if you look at the onset of the modern South African economy, started in Kimberley, where one, until that time, South Africa had been a provisioning station for ships going around the southern tip of Africa. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley started the first internal economic activity in the interior of the country. That brought infrastructure, it brought a demand for agricultural goods initially, and then ultimately a demand for energy, for equipment, for intermediate inputs. And so if you go to Johannesburg today, which is a thriving, it's still the largest, not the largest city, but certainly the most important industrial city in Africa, you will barely see shaft headgear. So yes, we have as an economy diversified around mining to the extent that mining is only contributing 8% of the gross domestic product of the country. But on the other hand, the economic multipliers in terms of employment and the impact on the secondary and tertiary sectors is still significant. The impact on our foreign exchange earnings is 40% is significant. So it's not a simple equation.
Let's discuss resource nationalism. Some people find its origins in perception that mining does not benefit society. Has this been the case in South Africa?
I think it's the case around the world. I mean, this is not a South African problem. I think it's starkly evident in South Africa because I've told you about the fact that mining catalyzed what is now a modern and diversified economy. So that's the best of the modern South African economy and political economy. But on the other side of it, it was mining in the early days, in the 1890s, 1880s to the early 1900s. It was the mining industry that brought in many of the social ills that have characterized the apartheid regime. So systems like migrant labor and job reservation and Group Areas Act, and where people live and don't live, were not the creation of the apartheid government. The apartheid government merely brought those into ideology and perfected them as ideology. But in the South African context, resource nationalism really is premised on the fact that at the change of government in 1994, the 6 mining companies controlled directly 70% of the economy. And so the whole question of white wealth and inequitability of economic benefit is still to this day, despite the fact that we have a declining industry, is symptomatic of white wealth and the exploitation of apartheid. So while that might not necessarily be the case still today, mining still drives the political economy to a very great extent. And elsewhere in Africa, I mean, the scramble for Africa that came out of the 1880s in Europe was all about minerals. So the opening up of Africa and strategic resources, the opening up of Africa and the colonization of Africa was premised on Europe's need to supply its own industries with raw materials. And it doesn't matter where you go in Africa. You can go to South Africa. If you look at what happened in the Belgian Congo, for example, and the cruelty and exploitation under King Leopold, the Portuguese, the Germans, and the genocide in Namibia. I mean, wherever you go in colonial Africa, one way and another, those processes originated through the need for minerals. And so this is still very, very much in the forefront of Africanization, is that you had the Second World War. Decolonization was followed by the Cold War, where you had the European and the Western countries competing for resources with the Eastern Bloc countries. After the fall of the Berlin Wall is only when Africanization started to take root, where there wasn't that struggle over Africa's resources. But it comes back again through China's interest in Africa. Now, I think that China's role in Africa is overestimated, certainly not from a market perspective, but from their actual ownership of resources. But the fact is that the mining industry is, with some justification, still seen as an exploitative industry and as a dirty industry.
You once described black economic empowerment as politics versus logic. What do you mean by this?
Investment is a long-term process, whereas poverty is a short-term reality. And so there's no rationality. You cannot explain to somebody who can't feed their family that they're deterring investments. And that's really where I was going. I don't believe that black economic empowerment is an irrelevant process. I think it's a very, very necessary process, and we haven't got that right in this country yet. But it is a deterrent to investors, because you don't have those provisions necessarily in other countries which also have attractive mineral resources. And so the conventional economic logic or wisdom of saying you want to reduce your rents, be they social rents, environmental rents, or transformational rents, should be reduced because you want to attract investment. It doesn't really work like that, but it is a fundamental problem in terms of deterring investors. But it's a process we have to complete and go through.
Moving into a different topic, you are involved in the UN Sustainable Development Goals project, and I see your pin here. But how relevant is mining for achieving the SDGs?
Since Brundtland in the 1980s, where the concepts of sustainable development were first introduced, we've got to go much further than that. And we've got to start looking at our non-renewable resources as catalysts for other forms of economic activity. And so the work that we're doing at the moment at the University of Cape Town, and where I am active, is looking at the whole question of economic succession planning. That means really is that you've got to start looking at substitutive and transformative economies around mining activity that will take over well in advance of the closure of a mine, and generally around agriculture. So mines have generally got large tracts of land, and they've got water, they've got infrastructure, they've got institutional capacity and strong balance sheets and high appetite for risks and long-term planning horizons. What is not happening is that mining companies are not looking at themselves through a different lens of being commercial developers of natural resources. They see themselves as diggers of hole in the ground, and they have a mandate from the shareholders to make as much money as possible for them. So we have to change our attitude to the way that we look at the mining industry and the way that we leverage the resources that we have at our disposal. And when I talk about resources, I'm not just talking about the mineral resources. I'm talking about your talent, your institutional capacity, and your balance sheets. And we haven't begun on that. And so the next step in the sustainable development is looking at economy beyond mining And if we can get that, I think that we will have achieved a lot more in terms of what you see as is an escape from a mining or mineral resource economy into a more diversified and sustainable economy.
Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.